ideology. That is to say, ideology is driven by factors beyond the ken of the person who thinks ideologically. So you see, the problem for consciousness now is not just a single problem, it's twofold. It's inauthentic relationship with the things it looks at, and also its inauthentic relationship with its own underpinnings. The argument is exactly the same for Nietzsche, only he shifts the ground of attack. For Nietzsche, the underpinnings of consciousness, which make the operations of consciousness inauthentic, are the nature of language itself. That is to say, that when we think we're telling the truth, we're actually using worn-out figures of speech. What then is truth? A mobile army of metaphors, metonymies, anthropomorphisms. In short, a sum of human relations which became poetically and rhetorically intensified, etc., 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 and now no longer and are now no longer of account as coins, but are debased. Now that word "now" is very important. It suggests that Nietzsche does somehow believe that there's a privileged moment in the history of language when perhaps language is a truth serum, when it is capable of telling the truth. But language has now simply become a question of worn-out figures, all of which dictates what we believe to be true. I speak I speak in a figurative way about the relationship between the earth and the sky, and I believe that there's a sky god. I speak because I simply don't believe that I'm using figures of speech. All of this is implied in Nietzsche's argument. In other words, language, the nature of language, the way language is received by us, in turn determines what we can do with it, which is to say, determines what we think. So that for Nietzsche, the distortion of truth, that is to say, the distortion of the power to observe in consciousness, has as its underlying cause language, the state of language, the status of language. Freud finally argues for exactly the same relationship between consciousness, that is to say, what I think I am thinking from minute to minute, and the unconscious, which perpetually, in one way or another, unsettles what I'm thinking and saying from minute to minute. You know that in the psychopathology of everyday life, Freud reminded us that the Freudian slip isn't something that happens just sometimes, and nobody knows this better than a lecturer. It's something that happens all the time. And the Freudian slip is something that one lives with simply as a phenomenon of the slippage of consciousness under the influence of the unconscious. Now, in the passage I gave you, Freud says a very interesting thing, which is that after all, we have absolutely no objective evidence that the unconscious exists. You know, I mean, the unconscious, if I could see the unconscious, it'd be conscious, right? The unconscious, what Freud is saying, is something that we have to infer from the way consciousness operates. We've got to infer something. We've got to figure out somehow how it is that consciousness is never completely inhibited, never completely does and says what it wants to say. So the spin on consciousness for Freud is the unconscious. Now, someone who didn't fully believe Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, a very important modern philosopher in the hermeneutic tradition named Paul Ricoeur, famously said in the first passage on your sheet that these great precursors of modern thought, and particularly, I would immediately add, of modern literary theory, together dominate a school of suspicion. There is, in other words, in Ricoeur's view, a hermeneutics of suspicion. And skepticism or suspicion is a word that can also be appropriated, perhaps more rigorously for philosophy, as negativity. That is to say, whatever seems manifest or obvious or patent in what we're looking at is undermined for this kind of mind by a negation, which is counterintuitive. That is to say, which would seem not just to qualify what we understand ourselves to be looking at, but to undermine it altogether. And these tendencies in the way in which Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud have been received. And when we read Foucault's What is an Author next time, we'll return to this question of how Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud have been received and what we should make of that in view of Foucault's idea that there's, well, you know, not that there's no such thing as an author, but that it's rather dangerous to believe that there are authors. Well, if it's dangerous to believe that there are authors, what about Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud? Foucault confronts this question in What is an Author and gives us some interesting results of his thinking. For us, the aftermath, precisely of the passages I've just quoted, but certainly of the oeuvre of the three authors I've quoted from, can, to a large degree, be understood as accounting for the topic, the phenomenon of literary theory as we study it. In other words, literary theory, because of the influence of these figures, is to a considerable degree a hermeneutics of suspicion, recognized as such both by its proponents and famously, I think this is perhaps what is historical for you, by its enemies. During the same period, when I was first teaching this course, a veritable 6-foot shelf of diatribes against literary theory was being written in the public sphere. There was the most, I mean, you can take or leave literary theory, fine. But the idea that there would be such an incredible outcry against it was one of the most fascinating results of it. That is to say, for many, many, many people, literary theory had something to do with the end of civilization as we know it. That's one of the things that seems rather strange to us today from an historical